This program is made possible in part by a grant from Charlotte Metcalf.
Whether to impeach President Donald Trump is an open question in American politics. Those who favor impeachment point no further than Volume 2 of the Mueller report and its accounts of apparent obstruction of justice by the president. Others caution that absent the ability to win a conviction in the Senate, impeachment would boomerang and only boost the president's popularity and likelihood of winning re-election in 2020. Today's guest argues that near-term political calculations are obscuring decisions and that the long history of impeachment strengthens the case for holding the president to account. He's Frank O. Bowman III this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. We do that by visiting each week with the best contemporary storytellers, authors, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists, really anyone using or studying narrative to explain the world in which we live. This week, we're joined by constitutional law scholar Frank O. Bowman III. His new book, High Crimes and Misdemeanors, is a look at the history of impeachment in the age of Donald Trump. Frank, thank you so much for being with us.
So glad to be here.
I was telling you in the green room that I think that this is the book that every thoughtful American needs to read at this moment. So congratulations.
That's the thing that every author wants to hear.
Well, so talk to us, though. What I loved about the book is that it's not just sort of Donald Trump and the case for or against impeachment for him, but it really is a grounding in the history of why we have articles of impeachment in our Constitution and the early, colonial history, the British history of impeachment. So walk the audience through that history. Where does impeachment come from in the British and the American context?
Well, the British invented impeachment. It was a creation of the British Parliament beginning back in the 14th century. And although it had a number of functions, the principal function that's important for us as Americans is that it was designed by Parliament as a means of dealing with the possibility of executive, by which they would have meant royal tyranny, royal overreach. As Parliament grew as an institution representing the other elements of society that weren't part of the royal family or its retainers, they needed a means to strike back at the crown when the crown was going too far. And short of holding a revolution and chopping the king's head off, which they did once, they needed some other means. And the idea was, early on, was you would strike at the king through striking at his ministers, on the theory that personnel's policy. And if you could get rid of some of the key personnel of the king, you could perhaps restrain him in the things that he was doing that they didn't care for. So they created a remedy for overreaching, misbehaving royal ministers, which looks a lot like what we've inherited today. For example, impeachment was started by the lower house of Parliament, the House of Commons. They would bring charges. Those charges were tried in the upper house, what they call the House of Lords. One big difference, though, in British impeachments and ours is the punishments. Because in Great Britain, if you were impeached and convicted by the House of Lords, you could have your title stripped, your lands taken away, you could be imprisoned, you could be banished, or you could have your head chopped off, as some people were. Nonetheless, despite the kind of bloody history of some impeachments, impeachment was an important tool of the growing power of British Parliament to try to counteract executive tyranny beginning in the 1300s all the way up to the time of our own revolution. In fact, there was an impeachment in Parliament that summer, the summer of 1787, impeachment of Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General of Bengal at the time. And the people who were gathering together in Philadelphia in summer of 1787 were actually quite aware of the fact that there was this impeachment going on over in England.
Well, and you also explain that the term high crimes and misdemeanors actually emerges from that British experience.
It does.
What does it mean?
Well, the thing about it is first of all, it doesn't mean what you think it means, just from looking at the words. It doesn't refer to misdemeanors, that is to say less serious crimes, which is what the word means here in modern times. And it doesn't even involve necessarily crimes, that is to say indictable wrongs for which you could be punished in a criminal court. The phrase comes from all those years of parliamentary history, and essentially, to make a very long story short, it was the phrase that Parliament often used just to describe the things for which it had impeached people. Now, there are some patterns in what Parliament did, and those patterns, I think, were very influential in the framers. For example, public corruption was a major point, including bribery and all the sorts of things that we would think of as being corrupt. Actually, oftentimes, mistakes or mismanagement of foreign policy was impeachable. General mismanagement of governmental affairs was impeachable. But again, the thing that was most important, the ground that was probably most important to the parliamentarians in the really big impeachments was the idea that any minister who threatened the safety of the realm, threatened the constitutional order of Great Britain, that person would be impeachable. And when the 1787 Constitutional Convention came along, and when they were deciding how to structure our Constitution, they made a couple of really important decisions about impeachment. First, to have it at all. Part of it is that was an inheritance from our British ancestors and their really British contemporaries. It was also an inheritance from earlier colonial practice, because it turns out that prior to 1776, there had been efforts in the colonies to impeach British officials and to strike back against royal power. And in the first constitutions that were written by the colonies turned states in 1776, in the period between 1776 and the drafting of the Constitution, state constitutions, almost all of them had impeachment provisions in them. So the first thing that's important to us about the federal Constitution is they decided to have this impeachment remedy. They decided to have it primarily because, even though impeachment reaches other classes of officials, they were primarily concerned about the president. All their debates really about impeachment in that summer were about the president. They were concerned about the fact that this president might, conceivably, although they thought of him actually as a much less powerful figure than we are accustomed to. Mm-hmm. They automatically thought of the most powerful branch of government as going to be Congress. But they were smart enough to recognize that since they were creating this executive official who embodied in himself all of the executive power, that the time might come this person might get a little out of hand. And they were particularly concerned about how to rein him or her in, although in those days it would certainly have been a him from their perspective, how they would rein him in if he got out of hand, if he became corrupt, if he became tyrannical.
So it was a check. It was a check on executive authority.
It was. And although interestingly, there was a debate at the beginning about whether or not they need to have it at all, because many of them said, well, we've got these elections, right? We're going to have elections every 4 years. This relatively weak officer that we imagine as the president, he's probably not going to get into too much trouble in 4 years, and if he becomes obnoxious, we'll simply vote him out. Other people said, no, we need another tool in the event that that isn't the case. And so what they came up with is impeachment. Then the question became, well, what should we impeach him for? And at the beginning of the summer, they thought about what words they should use to define what an impeachable offense should be. And they went through a whole variety of different formulations, most of them drawn from the state constitutions of the time, and including things like simple professional incompetence, simple bad governance. By the end of the summer, however, they whittled it all the way down so that the phrase that was on the floor was simply a treason or bribery. And George Mason did not care for that at all. He wanted a much more robust impeachment power.
Too high a threshold?
Well, he thought it was far too narrow.
Okay.
So on I think it was about September the 7th, he stands up in the assembly and says, in effect, fellas, this treason or bribery, I don't care for this, far too narrow. There are many, many things that a president might do that are not embraced by those two terms, which would be essentially dangerous to the Constitution that we are drafting and the broader Constitution that we imagine to grow upon this writing that we're going to create. So we need to broaden it. So he suggested first a very broad term, and when that broad term was objected to by Madison, then he said, well, if you don't like that, how about high crimes and misdemeanors? And everybody apparently looked around at each other and said, well, high crimes and misdemeanors, that sounds fine to us, and on they went. Now, of course, that's not how it really happened. I'm sure there was much more conversation back and forth. We don't really know. The notes are quite skimpy. But it's pretty clear to me that Mason went into that meeting recognizing that although his original proposal of a term might be rejected, that the high crimes and misdemeanors would be a fallback. What did he understand by that term? He, I think, was very well versed in British constitutional history. He understood that this was a term of art that had been used by Parliament to describe all the things it had been doing for the last 4 centuries. And I think he, and I think the other people who were in the room, James Madison and others, they understood, broadly speaking, that this was a term of art that embraced a whole variety of bad behavior by royal officials over 4 centuries, including all the categories that I've talked about before.
So a handful of American presidents have been impeached. Who was the first?
Well, there have only actually been 2 presidents impeached, because we have to remember that the word impeachment refers narrowly to the approval of articles of impeachment by the House of Representatives. This only happened twice. It happened with Andrew Johnson. It happened again with Bill Clinton. Of course, the only president who was ever successfully removed by an impeachment process, I suppose, would be Richard Nixon, but he was never technically impeached. You'll probably remember he was certainly involved deeply in the Watergate scandal. Articles of impeachment against him were voted out by the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives, but shortly after that occurred, some additional evidence emerged, the so-called smoking gun tape that those of a certain generation will remember, and a delegation of leaders from the Congress went to Nixon in the White House and said, Mr. President, you're going to have to resign. And he did. But the only 2 who have ever been actually impeached are Johnson and Clinton.
So how does the process work today, currently? There are at least, the House is involved and then the Senate has to finally vote. Just walk us through that, because I think there's a lot of confusion about exactly what the impeachment process is, who initiates it, how it is concluded, and so forth.
Well, formally, the Constitution's pretty terse about what's supposed to happen. It tells us that the House of Representatives has the exclusive power of impeachment, by which it means formulating the charges. It tells us that the Senate has the power of trying those charges. It tells us that if there's to be a trial in the Senate, it is to be presided over by the Chief Justice of the United States. But beyond that, and the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, it doesn't tell us very much. So we've come, for example, to think of it as being customary for the House Judiciary Committee to be the body that does the investigation or the formulation of the articles of impeachment. But that's not constitutionally necessary. Any group of members of the House, a special committee, I suppose a committee of the whole, could do that. There's also an interesting question, which is, I think, concerning the Democratic majority in the House right now, which is, do you need to have some sort of vote of the House as a whole to formally initiate an inquiry, a process? That happened certainly in the Nixon impeachment, and I believe in Clinton as well. And I think there is some question about whether the House Judiciary Committee is going to seek, or would seek, or must seek such approval from the House at large. But once they do, once they pass such a resolution, then the Judiciary Committee or some other committee that presumably would engage in an inquiry. If they conclude that high crimes and misdemeanors have been committed, they would draft articles of impeachment. Those would go for a vote before the full House. And then there's another interesting question. I think it had always been assumed up till today, that's to say the present era, current presidency, it had always been assumed that if the House of Representatives voted out articles of impeachment, there would necessarily be a trial in the Senate, or at least a vote on those articles in the Senate. Again, the Constitution doesn't say that there has to be. I think the norm has certainly always been that there would be, but people have begun to raise the question of whether or not the majority leader, Mr. McConnell, might actually just let the whole thing die and refuse to even bring it up.
So what would happen then? Then you have
Nothing.
nothing.
And I mean, I suppose there might be Senate rules of which I'm unaware that would provide some parliamentary mechanism to blow it out of onto the floor. But what those might be, I don't know. It seems to me there's very little other than tradition, public pressure, that would actually even force a vote.
It raises so as I was reading your account of the British history in particular of impeachment, what struck me in a lot of those cases is that politics still operated, at least on conceptually, on the principle of honor, and people could be held to account because they cared about their reputations and they cared about their honor. Does that still apply?
Well, I mean, I don't think we should hold up our British forebears too highly in that regard. I mean, impeachment in British practice was a very rough and nasty business.
It's ultimately a political act.
It is, and that's a key thing to understand. It is a political act with the trappings, with the clothing of a legal proceeding, which is one of the things that makes it confusing. It's why, for example, every time we start talking about impeachment, people want to treat it as a legal proceeding. They want to reach for language like high crimes and misdemeanors and say, well, what is the legal definition that constrains what we can do? The answer is, it's not a legal definition. What it is, it's a directional arrow. It's a guide. It's a signal to the political branches that, well, these are the kinds of things that the framers probably thought of as being impeachable, and therefore those are probably the kinds of things that you ought to consider as well. But another key point about impeachment in our Constitution is that, as we lawyers would say, it's not justiciable, meaning that whatever Congress decides to do, it's not reviewable in the courts. I recognize that Mr. Trump suggested somehow or other that if he were to be impeached, that he would sue, he'd go to the courts. Well, no. That's, I think, basically nonsense. There is no remedy in the courts for whatever Congress might choose to do, either to impeach or not to impeach. The process is political. It is, at bottom, a choice that consciously given to the political branches. The framers plainly thought very carefully about who should do this. In fact, they thought for a long time during the constitutional summer of 1787 that the trial ought to be in front of either the Supreme Court or some other body of specially selected judges. But in the end, they said, in effect, no, this is a political choice. This is about the protection of the political order. And the people who make that choice should themselves be political in the good sense of being involved in political life. And they should also be people who are accountable to the public for the choices that they make.
So clearly the pivotal person politically now is the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Yes.
Where does she stand on this? We know that she has urged caution. She has not suggested that we begin impeachment proceedings. Walk us through that.
Well,
as best you can.
I don't have any special
well, what do you think our
knowledge.
considerations are to take that position, which I think I've enunciated pretty clearly,
well,
as of early July when we're taping this?
What I can tell you is I'm down in Washington these days teaching a summer class at Georgetown, and therefore I've had an opportunity to be walking around the Hill a little bit, talking to at least a few congressional staffers. I don't purport to have any more insight into this than anybody would who's just reading the papers, but what I hear is the Speaker believes that if the Democrats initiate an impeachment inquiry, that that would cost Democrats the House, or at least it risks costing the Democrats the House.
In 2020.
In 2020. She is plainly unhappy with that prospect, and I think she believes, my guess is, that the political disadvantages of proceeding outweigh the perceived political advantages in an environment in which she has to make a choice that is really, I think, framed by two poles. On the one hand, at least in my view, if the House of Representatives, begin an impeachment inquiry, the facts as we know them essentially dictate that the only intellectually honest position at the end of that inquiry has to be that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has engaged in behavior that traditionally has been thought of as impeachable. I don't even think that's a questionable proposition.
I don't want you to lose your train of thought here, but walk us through what you think that case is.
It is potentially a very long and multifaceted case, but I can make the statement that I just made unequivocally because, and I say this as someone who was both a longtime former federal prosecutor and a student of this impeachment process. If one simply looks at the second volume of the Mueller report, Attorney General Barr's opinion to the contrary notwithstanding, it makes out an inescapable case that Mr. Trump committed obstruction of justice in both the technical legal sense and also in the constitutional sense that led to at least one of the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. Now, there are other points that might arise in an investigation or developing a case against Mr. Trump, notably including the fact that he is currently essentially stonewalling the not merely inquiries into things that might be impeachable for him personally, but essentially all executive branch functions by Congress. And the one thing that I gather from talking to people on the Hill is that the general public perception that this is happening, that there's a lot of obstruction going on by the administration, is, if anything, somewhat understated. Mm-hmm. That in effect what's happened is that the executive branch is essentially preventing Congress from performing its oversight function across the entire array of its responsibilities. That, too, it seems to me, if it hasn't already reached the level of being impeachable, it surely might. And there's, of course, a series of other issues, okay, that one could raise. So we begin, I think, with the position that if you start an inquiry, you've almost certainly got to produce at least one and maybe more articles of impeachment if you're going to be intellectually honest about it. At the other end is the near certainty that because this case would be resolved ultimately by the Senate, that there will be no conviction. It is simply inconceivable, at least at this moment to me, that you could get what would be required, a supermajority of the Senate to impeach, to convict. To convict requires, and this is the other critical point in the constitutional structure, in order for there to be a conviction, there must be a 2/3 vote for conviction in the Senate. That's the
66 votes.
67.
Right.
Okay, and in consequence, you would need, as the Senate is currently constituted, 20 Republican senators to vote for impeachment, which is just not going to happen in any universe we now inhabit. So Speaker Pelosi's dilemma is, if she starts impeachment, it's going to produce articles of impeachment. Not only are the facts, I think, there, but the political pressure from the Democratic base for members to vote would be overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And yet, she's not going to get removal. So the question is, what is the case for commencing an impeachment process that does not produce removal? I think there is one. There is such a case. But it's an awfully hard decision to make for the leader of a body who naturally wants to ensure that the party remains in the majority.
Is the case any more sophisticated than just do what's right?
I think it is. Remember, this is a political process, and that means that outcomes matter. If you're just doing it to have an interesting, glorious failure, I'm not in favor of interesting, glorious failures. Yeah. That's a foolish way, I think, to conduct public life. But to the extent there is a case for doing it, I think there are several things to be mentioned. One is that to the extent that the legislature is now, particularly the House, is now being blocked by the administration in its efforts to get lots of kinds of information about Mr. Trump and his affairs and other things that are going on in the administration, Congress's power of inquiry is dramatically increased the moment they decide that this is going to be an impeachment. Their general power of oversight, which is real and is one that is implied from the Constitution. It's not directly in the Constitution. The impeachment power is right in the Constitution, and I think it would be a very bold court that would suggest that the House of Representatives isn't entitled to anything it cotton picking well pleases in the way of information and impeachment inquiry.
We've got about 10 seconds left. If you were to look into your crystal ball, do you think we're going to see impeachment proceedings before the 2020 election?
I'm doubtful.
We got to leave it there. Frank Bowman, the book is High Crimes and Misdemeanors. Thank you so much for being with us. That is all the time we have this week. We could have gone on this topic, I think, for another 2 days.
Or 3 days.
Yeah, but if you want to know more about storing the public square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from Charlotte Metcalf.